Story number 1. The Beast of the Hollow. The village of Ashford lay hidden deep in the foggy hills, a place where the winds carried whispers and the very land seemed heavy with secrets. Its cobbled streets and crooked houses had stood for centuries, untouched by time. Yet, recently, a dark shadow had crept over the village, one that could not be seen but could certainly be felt. It began with the disappearances. One by one, people vanished. Farmers, traders, children, no one was safe. At first, it seemed like an odd coincidence, but as the days stretched into weeks and the number of missing grew, the whispers began. It was said that the hollow, the deep, forgotten valley that lay beyond the village, was cursed. Some spoke of a beast that lived there, a creature that was neither man nor animal. It had the body of a goat, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural red, and its howl could send a chill straight to the bones of even the bravest soul. The villagers kept to their homes after sundown, locking their doors tight, lest the Goatman come to claim them. But the fear was not enough to keep everyone safe. One evening, a stranger arrived in Ashford, his face lined with curiosity and concern. He was a man of quiet demeanor, with eyes that seemed to see through the fog. His name was Thomas Gray, and he had come seeking answers. A writer of sorts, he had heard rumors of the village and its strange happenings, and his instinct told him there was a story waiting to be uncovered. He sought out the oldest villager, a woman named Mrs. Calloway, who had lived in Ashford for longer than anyone could remember. Her house was perched on the edge of the village, facing the hollow, as though she had always known that the darkness beyond would eventually come for her. "Do you know of the beast?" Thomas asked her one evening, sitting across from her in her dimly lit parlor. Mrs. Calloway stared at him, her wrinkled hands clasped tightly together. "I know," she said in a voice as rough as the wind outside. "The Goatman is no mere legend, young man. It is a creature tied to the very land. When the village was first founded, the hollow was already there, ancient and untouched. The beast is a part of it, born from the earth itself." Thomas listened intently, his pen poised over his notebook, though he was beginning to wonder if he had come too far into the heart of something too dark for words. "The land, you see," Mrs. Calloway continued, her voice growing softer, "demands a blood price. It feeds on the lives of those who live near it, and every so often it calls for a sacrifice, a soul or two or even more." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. "And the Goatman? Is it the one who takes them?" Mrs. Calloway nodded gravely. "The creature serves as the land's judge and executioner. When it's hungry, it comes to claim what's owed. But it's not just a beast, it is a force, ancient and unforgiving. Some say it was born of a curse, others that it was summoned by the first settlers who disturbed the hollow. But one thing is certain: it will never stop until it's satisfied." Thomas left Mrs. Calloway's house with more questions than answers. He knew there was something to the old woman's tale, but what could he do about it? The villagers lived in terror of the hollow, refusing to venture near it even in daylight. That night, unable to shake his curiosity, Thomas ventured out into the fog. He walked through the narrow streets, past the silent homes, until he reached the edge of the hollow. The air was thick with mist, and the silence was suffocating. He could feel eyes watching him from the shadows. He stood at the mouth of the hollow, peering into the darkness, wondering if the creature was watching him. A sudden rustle in the bushes made him jump, but when he turned, there was nothing there. His breath was shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. It was then that he heard it, the sound of hooves against the earth. Slow, deliberate, echoing from deep within the hollow. And then a growl, a deep, rumbling growl that shook him to his core. The Goatman emerged from the mist, its eyes glowing like two red embers in the night. It was a towering figure, half man, half goat, its fur matted and its muscles rippling with an unnatural strength. The creature's gaze met Thomas's, and for a moment, he could see nothing but the red glow of its eyes. The air seemed to crackle with dark energy. Thomas stood frozen, his legs trembling beneath him. He had read about creatures like this in books, but seeing it in person was something entirely different. The fear was suffocating, but something else, something deeper, began to gnaw at him. He understood now. The creature was not just a beast. It was the land's keeper, its enforcer. "You must leave," the goatman's voice rumbled, low and guttural. "The price must be paid." Thomas stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. "What price?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The goatman stepped closer, its hooves scraping the ground. "A soul, a life. The land demands its due." And then, with a sudden motion, the creature lunged. The last thing Thomas saw before the darkness took him was the red eyes of the goatman, burning brighter than ever before. The next morning, the villagers found his body at the edge of the hollow. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of the creature, only the eerie silence that had fallen over the land once more. And so, the cycle continued. The beast of the hollow was not just a creature, it was a part of the land itself, a force that would never cease until it had claimed its due. And the villagers, though they whispered of it in fear, knew that it would always be watching, waiting for the next soul to wander too close to the cursed hollow. Story number 2. The Hoofbeats in the Night. It was on a particularly dark and cold evening that a group of weary travelers arrived at the old inn on the edge of an ancient forest. The inn was a small weathered building, with a crooked roof and a sagging porch, its windows glowing dimly in the fading light. The kind of place where, for all its age and creakiness, one might expect a warm fire and a hearty meal to ease the weariness of a long journey. The innkeeper, a grizzled man named Elias, welcomed them with a smile that did little to hide the weariness in his eyes. He quickly ushered them inside, where a fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. After a simple meal of bread, cheese, and stew, the travelers settled in for the night. They were a varied group, 3 men and 2 women, all from different places but united by the shared need for rest. One of the women, a sharp-eyed, restless sort, asked the innkeeper about the forest beyond the inn. The forest? Elias's voice lowered, as though the trees themselves might be listening. It's an old place. No one in these parts ventures far into it, not after dark. Best to keep away from the woods at night. The travelers laughed, dismissing his words as superstition, and soon enough they retired to their rooms. But as the night grew deeper and the wind began to howl, a strange sound began to echo through the stillness of the inn. The distinct rhythmic sound of hooves beating against the earth. At first, it was faint, a soft tapping that could have been anything, perhaps the wind or the creaking of old beams. But then it grew louder, a steady and unmistakable sound, as though something or someone was walking just outside the inn. The travelers sat up in bed, their eyes wide, listening in silence. "Do you hear that?" one of the men asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and unease. "I thought it was just the wind," another answered, though his voice lacked conviction. But there was no denying it now. The sound of hooves continued to echo through the night, rhythmic and purposeful, as though something was circling the inn. The group stood from their beds and hurried to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains. But when they looked out into the darkness, there was nothing to be seen. The forest stood still and quiet, the trees swaying ever so slightly in the breeze, their shadows stretching long in the pale moonlight. "It's just superstition," one of the men laughed nervously, shaking his head. "We're imagining things." But as the hours passed, and the hooves continued to sound, louder now, more insistent. Unease settled over the travelers like a thick fog. They huddled together by the fire, eyes darting nervously to the dark corners of the room where shadows seemed to stretch and writhe. And then, the innkeeper appeared, his face grim as he stepped into the room. He looked at them, his expression grave. "You heard it too, didn't you?" The travelers nodded silently, their fear palpable. "The hoofbeats," Elias said, lowering his voice as he leaned closer. "It's not just a sound, it's the creature, the one that haunts the forest." The travelers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to believe him. "There's a legend," Elias continued, his voice a low murmur, "of a beast that stalks the woods. They say it was a man once, long ago, a hunter, a man of great strength. But something dark took hold of him. Some say he made a pact with the woods, others claim he was cursed. Whatever the cause, he became something else, something not human. A creature with hooves like a horse, but with the body of a man. It is said he hunts those who trespass into his domain." The innkeeper's words sent a chill through the room. The travelers, for all their bravado earlier, now sat in silence, fear slowly creeping into their hearts. "There's no escape once it's found you," Elias said, his eyes flickering toward the window, where the dark woods stretched like an endless sea. "It hunts by the sound of your footsteps, by the scent of your fear. And tonight, I fear it has found you." The travelers sat frozen, too terrified to move. The sound of hooves had stopped, but in its place came something far worse. A feeling. It was as though eyes were watching them from the darkness, a presence just beyond the reach of the light. The air grew thick, and every creak of the inn's timbers made their hearts race faster. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door, a single, forceful knock that echoed through the room. "No one opens the door," Elias warned, his voice barely a whisper. "Not unless you want to bring the beast inside." The travelers huddled together in the corner, too frightened to speak. Time seemed to stretch on forever, the silence in the room broken only by the sound of their quickening breaths. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the hooves returned. Louder this time, closer. The travelers knew that whatever hunted the woods was drawing near. The creature was waiting. They stayed by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, their hearts pounding, as the sound of hooves grew ever closer, inching toward the door. And as the wind howled outside and the hooves beat upon the earth, the travelers realized the terrible truth. They had become part of the legend. Story number 3. The Goatman of Greystone Manor. It was on an overcast afternoon that I arrived at Greystone Manor, an imposing, isolated estate nestled on the edge of a forgotten moor. The mansion, with its towering spires and ivy-clad stone walls, seemed to be swallowed by the fog that crept relentlessly over the land. I had come at the invitation of my old friend, Charles Greystone, whom I had not seen in many years. Charles had written to me not long ago, inviting me to visit and promising that our time together would be filled with conversation and old memories. He mentioned nothing of any distress or trouble, and so I assumed it would be a peaceful visit. I was wrong. As I entered the manor, the heavy oak door groaned as if it had not been opened in some time. The dim light that filtered through the drawn curtains gave the place a strange, almost unnatural gloom. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, Charles was waiting for me in the grand foyer, his face breaking into a warm, albeit slightly distant, smile. "Ah, my dear friend, welcome," he said, his voice deep and welcoming as he shook my hand. "It has been far too long. Come, come, I will show you to your room." The house was strangely quiet, save for the occasional creaking of floorboards beneath our feet, as we ascended the grand staircase. Charles led me to a guest room that overlooked the overgrown gardens. The view, though obscured by the dense fog, was still impressive, but I couldn't help feeling a sense of discomfort as I looked out over the sprawling grounds. That evening, after a modest meal in the manor's large dining hall, we retired to the sitting room by the fire. Charles seemed in good spirits, though there was an air of distraction about him. We talked of old times, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something I couldn't quite place. The next few days only served to deepen my unease. At night, I would be awoken by the sound of footsteps in the hall, the heavy, deliberate thud of boots on the wood. Yet, whenever I rose to investigate, the hall would be empty. The first few times, I thought it merely a trick of the mind, but as the nights went on, I began to dread the inevitable sound. And then, there was the smell. At first, it was faint, a hint of rot that seemed to linger in the corners of the manor, growing stronger in certain rooms. I mentioned it to Charles, but he only brushed it off, speaking of the age of the house and its natural wear and tear. Yet, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of decay that seemed to hang in the air, pressing in on me as if the very walls of Greystone Manor were slowly dying. One evening, after a particularly unsettling night in which the footsteps had echoed through the halls for what felt like hours, I sat with Charles in the sitting room, my nerves fraying. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and the wind howled outside. "Charles," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "there's something wrong here. I hear footsteps at night, and this smell, it's unbearable. What is it? What's going on in this house?" Charles looked at me with a distant, almost sorrowful expression. For a moment he said nothing. Then finally he spoke. "There is something you must know," he said, his voice low. "A curse haunts this place. A curse that has followed my family for generations. It began long ago with my ancestor, Edward Greystone, who struck a bargain with a creature that dwells in the forest beyond this manor." I listened, captivated, as Charles recounted the tale, a tale of desperation and ancient rituals. Edward Greystone had been a man desperate for wealth and power, and in his greed he had made an unholy pact with a creature known as the Goatman, a beast that lived deep within the dark forests surrounding the manor. In exchange for riches and influence, Edward had promised to offer the firstborn of each generation as a sacrifice to the creature. The pact had been sealed with blood, and for many years the Greystone family prospered. But as with all dark bargains, the price was steep. Each generation of Greystones had been haunted by the Goatman, who would claim its due, the firstborn, when the time came. No matter how far they tried to flee, no matter how they tried to resist, the creature always found them. Charles explained that his father had been the last to fall prey to the Goatman, and now, as the curse continued to loom over the manor, it was only a matter of time before it came for him. The footsteps I had heard, the scent of decay, the oppressive atmosphere, it was all part of the creature's approach, its presence drawing nearer with each passing day. "You must leave," Charles said, his voice strained with a mixture of fear and resignation. "The Goatman is coming, and I can't escape it, but you still can." I stood there, my mind reeling. I had come to visit an old friend, but now I found myself in the midst of a nightmare far beyond my comprehension. I could not deny the truth of Charles's words. The air felt heavier. The house seemed to tremble with the presence of something dark and terrible just beyond the veil. I had a choice to make. As I stood there, torn between the loyalty I felt toward my friend and the overwhelming terror that filled me, I heard it. Again, that sound. The unmistakable sound of hooves pounding heavily against the earth, growing louder with each passing second. The Goatman had arrived. I fled from Greystone Manor that night, not daring to look back as I heard the guttural growl of the creature and the scream of my friend, trapped by the curse of his family's past. And as I escaped into the mist, I could still hear the hooves behind me, growing fainter, yet never quite fading away. I wonder, sometimes, if I left too soon. If I had stayed, would I have been able to help my friend? Or was it too late for him, for his family, for all of us? All I know is that Greystone Manor still stands, its dark past waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close. And the Goatman, he still waits. Story number 4. The Cursed Forest. I had always felt a strange pull toward the village of Hartwell, though I had never set foot there before. The village was tucked away in the shadow of a dense forest, a place few outsiders ever dared to enter. It was the kind of place where the air was thick with mystery, where the winds whispered secrets through the trees, and where the villagers spoke in hushed tones about things best left unspoken. I had come to Hartwell with a singular purpose: to trace my family's heritage. My grandmother had often told me stories of the village, of distant relatives who had lived there long ago. She spoke of it with a mix of love and fear, and I had always wondered why she had never returned to the village herself. The village, though small and remote, was picturesque. Old cottages lined the cobbled streets, and the people, though friendly enough, seemed distant, as if they were all connected by something unseen, something hidden just beneath the surface. It was the forest, however, that held the true mystery. I had heard the villagers whispering about it as I walked through the streets. Words like cursed and dangerous hung in the air like a warning. They spoke of people who had vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. Some said the forest was alive, that it held dark secrets, and that it was a place where time itself seemed to warp. Still, my curiosity got the better of me. I knew that if I were to truly understand my family's history, I would have to confront the forest. That evening, after the last light had faded from the sky and the villagers had retreated to their homes, I ventured into the woods. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the thick trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The air was heavy, as though the very forest was holding its breath, watching my every move. The deeper I went, the more the woods seemed to close in around me. The path, once clear, grew tangled with undergrowth, and the shadows seemed to shift with an unnatural life. It wasn't long before I realized that I was no longer sure which direction I had come from, and then I heard it, the sound of hooves. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps an animal, but the sound grew louder, closer. It was deliberate, slow, like the beating of some great creature's heart. I stopped, heart racing, straining to see through the dense fog that had begun to roll in. And then I saw him. The creature emerged from the shadows, half man, half goat, with glowing red eyes that burned like embers in the dark. His body was massive, and his hooves struck the earth with a deafening thud, each step seeming to echo through the very ground beneath me. I froze, unable to move, as the Goatman's gaze locked onto mine. His presence was overwhelming, his eyes seething with something ancient and terrible. "You are the last of them," the Goatman spoke, his voice low and rumbling, as if it came from the very depths of the earth. "Your bloodline is cursed, and I have been its keeper for centuries." I staggered backward, unable to tear my eyes away from the creature. My thoughts scrambled for understanding. "What do you mean?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What is this curse? What do you want with me?" The Goatman took a step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. "Your ancestors made a pact with the forest, with me," he said, his voice dark and filled with an unsettling reverence. "They sold their souls for power, and in return, I promised to protect their lineage. But the price of that power was steep. The curse would follow their bloodline, and every generation would face the same fate. The realization struck me like a blow. I had always wondered about the strange, dark pull I had felt toward the village in the forest. My family's history, so filled with secrets, was bound to this place. And now, it seemed, I had inherited more than I had ever wanted to know. The Goatman's gaze softened, and for a moment I thought I saw pity in his eyes. It is not just the bloodline you carry. You are the last link. The curse will claim you, just as it claimed all who came before you. I trembled, my heart pounding in my chest. How can I escape this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What must I do? The Goatman's face twisted into something that almost resembled a grin, though it was far from comforting. To break the curse, he said, you must face the truth of your ancestors' actions. You must confront the pact they made, and you must choose whether to embrace it or to let it consume you. A cold, heavy silence filled the forest, and I knew what I had to do. There was no running from this, no escaping it. The forest had claimed my family long ago, and it was up to me to end it. With a deep breath, I stepped forward, my voice steady as I spoke to the Goatman. I will face it, I said. I will confront my ancestors' dark past, but I will not allow their curse to define me. The Goatman nodded, his eyes gleaming with something like approval. Then you may survive. But remember, the forest always keeps its secrets. The choice is yours, and it is a heavy one. As I turned to leave the forest, the hooves of the Goatman faded into the distance behind me, leaving only the eerie silence of the woods. I knew that my journey was far from over, that the dark history of my ancestors would follow me for as long as I lived. But I was determined to face it, and I would survive. Story number 5. The Call of the Horned One. It was in the quiet, unassuming town of Langdon, nestled in the rolling hills of southern England, that I first encountered the legend of the Goatman. I am Professor Edward Granger, a man of reason and science, who for years had devoted himself to the study of anthropology. My life was centered around the understanding of cultures, histories, and ancient beliefs. But it was during one of my regular visits to the local library, where I stumbled upon an old, dusty tome, that my obsession began. The book was thick, bound in worn leather, and its pages were fragile, yellowed with age. It was written in a language I could not immediately recognize, though there was something strangely familiar about it. The title was written in a script that seemed almost too archaic for any modern tongue, De Occultis Spiritibus, the dark forces of old. I couldn't resist. I borrowed it, though it was clear to the librarian that few had handled it in years. That night, as the wind howled outside my small cottage on the outskirts of Langdon, I opened the book. What I read sent a cold shiver down my spine, for it told of a creature, no, a spirit, that had been summoned throughout history. The Goatman. It was described in various forms in different cultures, a figure with the body of a man and the head of a goat, crowned with twisted horns. The creature was no mere myth, no folk tale to amuse children by the fire. It was a malevolent spirit, one that had been called upon in times of strife, vengeance, or greed. It was said to dwell in the darkness, a being tied to the earth, capable of influencing the hearts and minds of men. The more I read, the more I became enthralled by the tale. Ancient rituals, whispered incantations, and blood sacrifices. Each page seemed to reveal more about the Goatman's origins. I could not stop myself from diving deeper into the legend, much to the detriment of my other work. My colleagues at the university noticed my growing obsession, but I paid them no heed. The truth, I believed, was in the pages. Hidden within the myths, waiting to be uncovered. As the days passed, I began to experience strange occurrences. It started with a sense of unease, a subtle weight pressing against my chest, like an unseen hand was always hovering just behind me. I would hear faint whispers at the edge of my hearing, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. At night, my dreams became darker. I dreamt of a forest, thick with fog, where twisted trees reached out like fingers, and there, standing in the shadows, was the Goatman. His eyes gleamed with a dreadful intelligence, his horns jutting out in grotesque angles. In my dreams, he would never speak, but I could hear his call, the low, guttural sound that vibrated in my bones, a call to something deep within me. The whispers, at first distant, grew louder. They no longer came only in my sleep, but in the waking hours as well. When I sat at my desk, trying to focus on my research, I could hear them, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but soon growing more insistent. Words, unintelligible at first, but becoming clearer with each passing day. They were calling my name. Edward. I thought I was losing my mind. Was it the isolation of my cottage? The long hours of study? But I could not shake the feeling that something more was at play. The Goatman, was he truly a myth? Or had I, in my obsession, stumbled upon something far darker? Something ancient and malevolent, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The more I read, the more I found. The Goatman was not just a creature of myth, but a being that had been summoned throughout history, sometimes by priests, other times by rulers, and in some cases by desperate men seeking revenge. It was said that the Goatmen could not be summoned by mere words alone, but by blood. A sacrifice was required, an offering to draw the creature from the depths of the earth and into the world of men. And then, one evening, as I pored over another passage in the cursed book, I found it. A ritual, a dark ritual that called upon the Goatman to awaken. The description was chilling, the steps meticulous. It required a specific incantation, a precise sacrifice, and an offering of the purest blood. The blood of the one who sought vengeance, the one who yearned for power. The realization struck me with horrifying clarity. The Goatman had been summoned before, but he had always been bound to the one who called him. His existence was intertwined with theirs. I had been drawn into this dark history, and my obsession with the Goatman had led me to the final step, the point of no return. That night, as I lay in my bed, the whispers came again. This time, they were not distant. They were right next to me in the very room. I could feel them vibrating in the air, surrounding me, closing in. The sound of hooves, heavy and slow, echoed from the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as the air grew thick and oppressive. I could not move. I could not speak. The Goatman's presence was palpable, and I knew, without a doubt, that he had come for me. In the dark, I saw him. His eyes gleamed in the shadowed corner of my room, his twisted horns casting strange, terrifying shapes on the walls. The whispers now became a chant, a call that only I could hear, a summons that tugged at the very core of my being. "You are mine," he whispered, his voice low and deep, as though it came from the earth itself. "You called me." The terror that gripped me was unlike anything I had ever felt. The Goatman's presence was overwhelming, and yet in my fear I realized the truth. My obsession, my study, had led me here. I had unwittingly completed the ritual by seeking the knowledge, by calling upon the spirit of vengeance. And now it was too late. The whispers grew louder and the shadows seemed to close in. I understood now that the Goatman was not simply a myth. He was a force, an ancient malevolent spirit tied to the very fabric of the earth. And I had become his servant. I do not know what has become of me. I write this as I feel the pull of his call once again, the whispers growing ever louder, more insistent. The Goatman has claimed me, and I fear there is no escape. To those who may read this, beware. The knowledge you seek may be the very thing that summons the darkness. Story number 6, The Pact of the Goat. My name is Thomas Vane, a man of wealth and means who had lived a life of comfort and ease. But none of that mattered as I stood helpless at the bedside of my beloved wife, Eleanor. She was dying, her once vibrant eyes now clouded with pain and fever, her body frail and wasting away before my very eyes. I had sought every doctor, every treatment that money could buy, but none could offer a cure. I watched as the woman I loved slowly slipped away, and with each passing day I felt my own soul wither. Desperation took hold of me, and in my frantic search for a solution, I began to hear whispers of an ancient witch who lived on the outskirts of the village, a woman rumored to possess powers beyond mortal understanding. They said she could bargain with forces that no man should ever dare to confront. Desperate as I was, I decided I would seek her out. Perhaps, I thought, she could save Eleanor. What else did I have to lose? One cold and misty evening, I made my way to the witch's cottage. The path was treacherous, overgrown with weeds, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. I knocked on the door, and after a long pause it creaked open. The woman who stood before me was old, her eyes sharp and unblinking. Her hair, long and silver, flowed like a river of moonlight down her back. "You seek me out, Thomas Vane," she said in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of ages. "I know why you have come." Her words struck me with the force of a blow. How could she know? But I dared not question her. Instead, I explained my plight, how my wife lay dying, and how I would do anything at all, to save her. The witch listened in silence, her eyes never leaving mine. Then, finally, she spoke. "There is a price for such things, you know. The forces I deal with are not kind. And the Goatman, he has long been a harbinger of dark bargains." The name struck me like a thunderclap. The Goatman. I had heard rumors, stories told by the villagers of a creature, part man and part goat, who roamed the woods at night, seeking souls for trade. A figure of dread and darkness, one who never made deals lightly. But I was beyond reason, beyond caution. The thought of losing Eleanor to the slow, creeping death that had already claimed her was unbearable. "I don't care about the price," I said, my voice breaking. "I'll pay whatever it takes." The witch's eyes darkened, and a shiver ran down my spine. "Very well," she said. "But remember, once you make the pact, you cannot turn back. The Goatman will come for his due, and it will not be just your wife's life he seeks." I was too desperate to understand the weight of her words. "I don't care," I repeated. "I want her life saved. I'll do anything." The witch nodded, as though she had expected my answer. She gave me a small, withered scroll, its edges curling with age. "Take this," she said, "and go to the forest at midnight. There you will find the Goatman. He will come to you when you call. But remember, Thomas Vane, once you make the pact, you will never be free of it." I took the scroll, my hands trembling. As I left her cottage, I could feel the weight of the witch's warning pressing down on me, but I was too consumed by my desire to save Eleanor to heed it. That night, at the witch's command, I ventured into the forest. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, and the path was barely visible in the dim moonlight. I unrolled the scroll, reading the ancient words written in a language I could not fully understand. As I uttered the final incantation, the air grew cold, and a low, rumbling growl echoed from the depths of the woods. The Goatman appeared, his massive, hulking figure emerging from the shadows. His eyes glowed with an unearthly red light, and his hooves struck the ground like thunder. His twisted horns curved upward, and his body, part man, part beast, seemed to shimmer with dark energy. "Thomas Vane," the Goatman growled, his voice a guttural rasp. "You have called me, and I shall grant your wish. Your wife's life shall be spared, but the price will be paid in blood." I nodded eagerly, too blinded by my desire to save Eleanor to understand the full extent of the deal I was striking. The Goatman raised his hand, and I saw, for the briefest moment, the shadow of a dark smile on his face. "I shall save her," he said, "but she will not be the only one to suffer." With those words, the pact was sealed. I returned home that night, my heart light with the knowledge that Eleanor would live. But as the days passed, I began to feel a creeping sense of unease. Eleanor's health improved. Her strength returned, and her once pale cheeks took on color. But with each passing day, I began to hear strange sounds in the night. Footsteps, whispers, and the sound of hooves. The atmosphere in our home grew heavy, as though something unseen was always lurking just out of sight. It wasn't long before I realized the terrible truth. The price the Goatman had demanded was not just for Eleanor's life, but for my own. I began to feel my own body wither, my strength fading as though it were being drained away, piece by piece. My mind grew clouded, and I could no longer sleep without hearing the hooves that echoed through my dreams. Desperate, I sought out the witch once more, hoping she might have some way to break the curse. When I arrived at her cottage, she listened to my frantic pleas with a grave expression. "There is no escape," she said softly. "The Goatman's price has been paid, and you cannot undo it. He will come for you in the end." I begged her for a solution, but she shook her head. "You have sealed your fate, Thomas Vane. The Goatman always claims what is owed." In the weeks that followed, my health deteriorated further. I could feel the Goatman's presence everywhere, in the shadows, in the silence between heartbeats. And as I lay on my deathbed, I realized the truth too late. The pact had been made, and it had cost me far more than I could have ever imagined. The Goatman came for me that night, his hooves echoing through the darkened house. And as he took me, I saw Eleanor, still living, standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, and though she was alive, I knew the price for her life would never truly be paid. The pact had been sealed, and neither of us would ever escape its grip. And so, in the darkness, the Goatman claimed what he was owed, and my soul became another part of the curse that had bound me. Story number 7. The Harvest. I arrived at the village of Greystone on a cool autumn afternoon, eager to explore its famous harvest festival. It was a quaint, isolated place, nestled among rolling hills and thick, ancient woods. The village, though small, had an air of quiet prosperity that seemed to permeate every corner. The people greeted me with warm smiles, their faces weathered by years of hard work, but their eyes always seemed to hold something more, something unreadable. As I settled into the local inn, I quickly learned that the Harvest Festival was the highlight of the year. The village would gather for feasts, music, and dancing in celebration of the bountiful harvest. But there was something odd about the villagers' enthusiasm. They spoke of the festival with a strange reverence, as if it were a sacred ritual, not just a joyous occasion. Still, I was a stranger, and such things could easily be explained away by the village's long history and customs. The festival was set to take place in just a few days, and I spent my time wandering the village, chatting with the locals, and taking in the beauty of the surrounding countryside. The fields were lush, the crops ripe for picking, and the villagers seemed genuinely proud of their hard-earned bounty. But there was a shadow in the air, an unsettling feeling that I could not quite shake. As I made my way through the village square on the evening before the festival, I noticed that the elders of the village were gathered in hushed conversation at the far end of the square. Their faces were grim, their postures tense. There was no joy in their expressions, only a heavy burden that seemed to weigh them down. I approached an elderly man, hoping to learn more about the festival, but he looked at me with a caution that made me pause. "You'll see tomorrow," he muttered before turning away, his words cryptic and heavy with an unspoken meaning. His reaction only fueled my growing unease. The next morning, as the villagers busied themselves with preparations for the festival, I overheard snippets of conversation that were far from the usual cheer one would expect before such an event. There were whispers of the offering and the price that had to be paid. At first, I dismissed these as mere superstitions, remnants of old customs long since forgotten by the outside world. But as the day wore on, I could not help but feel that something was terribly wrong. That evening, as twilight descended upon the village, the festival began. The square was filled with light from countless lanterns, and the sounds of music and laughter echoed through the air. The villagers danced and sang, their faces alight with joy. But there was an undercurrent of something darker, something I could not place. I watched as the elders moved to the center of the square, their faces grim as they began a ritualistic chant. They held hands, their eyes closed, as if in deep concentration. The villagers, too, fell silent, and for a moment the entire square seemed to hold its breath. It was then that I realized this was not a mere celebration. This was a ceremony. Curiosity tugged at me, and I moved closer to the elders, unnoticed in the growing darkness. As I crept through the shadows, I caught sight of something that sent a chill down my spine. In the distance, beyond the village, at the edge of the woods, a figure stood. Tall, massive, and clad in shadow. The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural red light, and its twisted, goat-like horns rose from its head, curving into the sky like the branches of a gnarled tree. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature was real. The Goatman, the very figure I had heard whispered about in hushed voices since my arrival, was standing in the woods, watching. I turned to run, but something caught my eye, something far worse. The villagers, the ones who had been dancing and singing just moments before, had stopped in their tracks. They turned slowly toward the figure in the woods, their faces empty, devoid of any emotion. As one, they began to move, like puppets guided by invisible strings, toward the edge of the village, where the Goatman stood waiting. I followed, my legs shaking, as the villagers made their way through the mist, drawn to the creature in the woods. As they reached the clearing, they fell to their knees, their hands raised in supplication. The elders, too, had joined them, their faces twisted with a strange reverence. The Goatman stepped forward, its red eyes glowing like burning embers in the night. It was then that I heard the whispers in the air, words that seemed to come from all around me, from the very earth beneath my feet. The villagers, their heads bowed in shame, were speaking in low voices, confessing sins I could not understand. The Goatman did not speak, but its presence was enough. It was the embodiment of something ancient, something born from guilt and suffering. I understood then. The harvest, the prosperity the village had enjoyed for so many years, was not the result of hard work alone. It had come at a price. The villagers had made a pact with the Goatman long ago, an agreement that demanded a sacrifice every year in exchange for the bounty of the land. And now, as the villagers confessed their sins, the Goatman would claim its due. In that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. The Goatman was not just a creature of the woods. It was the manifestation of the village's guilt and sin, a dark force summoned by the very sins of those who sought to escape the consequences of their actions. They had been living in a lie, feeding the land with their blood, all in the name of survival and prosperity. I turned to flee, but my legs refused to move. The whispers grew louder, the weight of the village's guilt pressing down on me. The Goatman's eyes turned toward me, and in that instant, I knew there would be no escape. I had become part of the harvest, a part of the terrible secret the village had been hiding for centuries. The last thing I heard as the Goatman's cold grip closed around me was the villagers' voices, chanting in unison, calling upon the ancient pact to claim another soul. And so, the harvest continued. Story number 8. The Shadow of the Horned One. I had long been in search of peace, something to quiet the turmoil in my mind, so when the opportunity came to inherit a small cabin in the mountains from a distant relative, I saw it as the perfect chance to escape the noise of the world and find solitude. The cabin, tucked away in the deep woods, was simple and isolated, exactly what I needed. I arrived with a sense of hope and expectation, the weight of the world lifting as I left the city behind. The air in the mountains was fresh, the trees towering high above, and the only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. It seemed perfect, a place where I could reflect on my life, free from distractions. I had planned to stay a week alone, to clear my mind and rediscover myself. The first few days were peaceful, but a strange restlessness began to settle over me. It was as though the quiet of the mountains was too still, too empty. The days passed in a haze of silence, broken only by the occasional bird call or the creak of the cabin settling under the weight of time. I tried to focus on reading, but my mind kept wandering, and I found myself pacing the small cabin late into the night, restless and uneasy. On the third night, things began to change. It started with faint noises, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, a soft, scratching sound that echoed in the stillness of the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind, or the house shifting, but as the days went on, the noises grew louder. I could hear footsteps outside the cabin, but when I opened the door, there was no one there. A sense of being watched began to crawl over me, though I could never see anyone, not even a shadow. By the 5th day, I was no longer sure if I was imagining things. I would hear things in the woods, hooves, heavy and deliberate, tapping against the ground like the sound of a great beast walking just outside my reach. Each night, the noises grew more distinct, more ominous. But the most unsettling thing was the feeling that I was not alone in my own mind. That evening, as I sat by the fire, my nerves stretched thin, I stumbled upon an old journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The leather cover was worn and cracked, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. It was the journal of a man named Samuel Gray, who had once lived in the cabin. His entries were filled with strange, fragmented thoughts, and as I read, a creeping dread began to fill me. Samuel spoke of things I could not comprehend, visions of a shadow in the woods, a figure with glowing eyes and twisted horns. The Goatman. He wrote that the creature would come to those who stayed too long, that it would invade their minds and drive them to madness. He described hearing whispers, seeing things that weren't there, and feeling the presence of the Goatman even when it wasn't visible. The more Samuel wrote, the more his words became incoherent, until his final entry, where he simply wrote, "The Goatman knows me now. It comes for me in the dark." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. My mind raced with questions. Was it possible that the creature in Samuel's journal was real? Had the Goatman been here all along, hiding in the woods, waiting for the next victim to fall into its grip. That night, I could not sleep. The cabin seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the walls closing in on me. The whispers were louder now, unmistakable, as though the very air around me was alive with sound. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, though I knew there was nothing there. But it was the hooves I heard most clearly now, slow and deliberate, approaching the cabin from outside. I could almost feel the ground vibrating beneath the sound. I opened the door, heart pounding, but there was nothing to see, only the thick darkness of the forest surrounding the cabin. The air was still, too still, and the cold seemed to bite deeper than it should have. As I stepped outside, I felt a presence behind me, something watching, waiting. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned to face the woods, but all I could see was the inky blackness. That was when I saw it. A figure moved at the edge of my vision, tall and imposing, with glowing eyes that pierced the dark. It was a man, or something like a man, with the twisted horns of a goat rising from its head. The Goatman. I knew, without a doubt, that it was him. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt like stone. The creature's presence pressed down on me, suffocating, as though it was inside my very mind. I could hear it then, the whispering, soft, almost soothing at first, but growing louder, more insistent. It was calling my name, beckoning me into the woods. The hooves continued, now a constant drumbeat in my ears. My thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. The Goatman was not just a creature of the woods. It was something more, something that didn't just haunt the land, it haunted the mind. It infected the thoughts of those it chose, pushing them toward madness, towards the very edge of their sanity. The whispering grew louder, filling my ears, my thoughts, until there was nothing left but the call. I could feel myself slipping, losing control, as if the Goatman was slowly taking over my very being. I was no longer sure where the creature ended, and I began. I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen, staring into the darkness. The last thing I recall is the feeling of a cold breath on my neck, the touch of something unseen, and the final whisper, "You are mine." When I awoke, it was morning, the sun casting its weak light through the trees. The cabin was quiet, the air still, but I knew, deep in my bones, that the Goatman had marked me. I had seen his shadow in the woods, and I had heard his call. I had become part of the creature's dark world, trapped in the grip of a madness I could not escape. And so, I left the cabin, but the shadows of the Goatman still follow me. The whispers never stop. Story number 9, The Silent Witness. It was in the quiet and forgotten corners of the countryside that the murders began. At first, they seemed like simple tragedies, isolated killings with no clear motive. But as the bodies began to pile up, the local authorities were forced to bring in someone with more experience, someone who could look beyond the obvious. That was how I, Detective Samuel Harris, found myself in this sleepy little village, staring down a case that would unravel far more than I had ever anticipated. The victims were all local residents, people who lived simple, unremarkable lives. But there was one detail that began to haunt me. Each of the victims had some connection to the Braxton family. The Braxtons were an old family, reclusive and shrouded in mystery, with a history steeped in rumors of strange rituals and whispered tales of forbidden practices. They were known to keep to themselves, their estate hidden deep within the woods, and their name was rarely spoken without a note of unease. The first victim was a man named James Harrow, a farmer who lived on the outskirts of the village. His throat had been slit, his body found in the field near his home, his eyes wide with terror. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of robbery or personal vendetta. His death was brutal, but it seemed almost ritualistic. And that was when I first heard the name of the Goatman. At first, I dismissed it as superstition, an old legend that had been passed down through generations. But as the bodies piled up, all connected to the Braxton family in one way or another, I began to wonder if there was more to the story. The killings followed a pattern, and with each murder I felt the shadow of something ancient drawing closer. It was during my investigation that I met an old woman named Agatha, a local historian who had lived in the village for as long as anyone could remember. She was the first to tell me about the Goatman, a creature said to haunt the woods surrounding the Braxton estate. The legend spoke of a monstrous being, part man and part goat, that had been summoned by the Braxtons generations ago to protect their bloodline and exact revenge on those who had wronged them. The Goatman, according to the legend, was more than just a creature. It was a twisted force, an entity that fed on the guilt and sins of its followers. It was said to be bound to the family, and every generation had been tasked with feeding it in exchange for its protection. The more I dug into the Braxton family's history, the more I uncovered. The Braxtons were not simply wealthy landowners. They were a family marked by bloodshed and dark rituals. They had been tied to the land for centuries, and their wealth came at a price that the villagers had long feared to question. The family's secrets were buried deep, but as I dug further, I began to uncover a disturbing truth. The Braxtons had used the Goatman to settle old scores, to exact vengeance on those who crossed them or sought to uncover their dark ways. I spent days poring over old records, visiting the village's archives, and speaking with anyone who might know about the Braxtons' history. It was then that I learned of a man named Edward Braxton, a distant ancestor of the current family who had struck a bargain with the Goatman years ago. Edward Braxton had been a cruel and vindictive man, feared by all who knew him. He had used the Goatman to destroy his enemies, to rid himself of anyone who threatened his power. But the cost of such a pact was steep, and the legend claimed that the Goatman's thirst for blood could never be fully satisfied. The Braxtons were trapped in a cycle of violence, bound by a pact that could never be undone. As I uncovered these truths, I began to feel the weight of something pressing down on me, something watching me from the shadows. I started to see things, figures in the corners of my vision, fleeting glimpses of shapes that disappeared the moment I turned my head. The whispers began as well, faint at first, but growing louder each day. It was as if the very air around me was thick with guilt, and I realized that I, too, was becoming entangled in the Braxtons' web of terror. Then came the night when everything changed. I was alone in my hotel room, the case files spread out before me, when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find no one there, but the smell of fresh earth filled the air, as though the very ground had been disturbed. On the doorstep, I found a small wooden box, its surface scratched and weathered with age. Inside the box was a single, blood-stained letter, its ink barely legible. The letter contained only a single sentence: "The Goatman knows your guilt." I felt my heart race as the realization hit me. The Goatman had come for me. It was not just the Braxtons who were tied to its dark pact. I had unknowingly become part of the story, a part of the cycle of vengeance. My own past, my own mistakes had led me here, to this point of no return. That night, the dreams began. I dreamt of the Braxton estate, its walls towering and oppressive, surrounded by dark, twisted trees. In my dream, I saw the Goatman, his eyes glowing red, his twisted form looming over me. I could feel its presence, not just in the dream, but in my waking hours as well. It was always there, watching, waiting. The whispers grew louder, and soon they were not just in my dreams. They were in my thoughts, in my mind, clawing at my sanity. I realized then that the Goatman was not merely a creature of flesh and bone. It was a force, a manifestation of guilt, vengeance, and madness. It didn't just kill, it consumed the very soul of those it touched. The victims were not only punished for their sins, but for the sins of their ancestors. And I, too, was trapped in that cycle, my own guilt and obsession drawing me ever closer to the creature's grip. The murders stopped as suddenly as they had begun, but I knew that the Goatman had claimed its due. The Braxtons were gone, their bloodline severed by the creature they had summoned. And as I stand here today writing this account, I realize that I am the final witness, the last one to know the truth. The Goatman is still out there in the woods, waiting. And it is not done with me yet. It is watching. Always watching. The price for my knowledge has not yet been paid. Story number 10. The Dark Bargain. The weight of loss had become too much for Victor Hawthorne to bear. His wife, Eleanor, and their young daughter, Lily, had been taken from him in an accident that left his heart shattered and his soul empty. The grief was a suffocating cloud that wrapped itself around him, making every moment a struggle. In search of solace, Victor decided to retreat from the world. He rented a small cabin deep in the woods, far from the reminders of his past, where he hoped the silence of nature would offer him peace. The cabin was rustic, nestled at the edge of an ancient forest. Its walls creaked with age, and the air smelled of damp wood and pine. For a time, the solitude was all Victor had hoped for. The peace, however, soon turned into a sense of unease. The forest was no ordinary place. It was thick and dark, the trees towering like ancient sentinels. Even in the light of day, the woods seemed heavy with an unnatural presence, as if something was watching, waiting. Victor spent his days wandering the forest, trying to escape the crushing weight of his memories, but the pain never faded. His nights were worse. He could hear the wind howling through the trees, whispering like voices in the dark, and he would often wake in a cold sweat, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on him. He had heard the locals' warnings before coming, warnings about the Goatman, a creature that roamed the forest, feeding on the sorrow and despair of those who ventured too far into its domain. They spoke of a twisted, horned figure with red eyes, who was said to grant peace to the grieving, but at a terrible cost. Victor dismissed their warnings as the superstitions of simple folk. He had nothing left to live for but his own torment, and if there was even a chance that the creature could grant him peace, he would take it. Desperation clouded his judgment, and one evening, as the sky grew dark and the forest seemed to hum with anticipation, he ventured deeper into the woods than he ever had before. There, at the edge of the forest, in a clearing bathed in moonlight, he saw it. The Goatman. It stood taller than any man, its body a grotesque blend of human and beast. Its head was that of a goat, with twisted horns that curled menacingly around its skull. Its eyes glowed like coals, burning with an ancient hunger. Victor froze in fear, but the creature did not move. It simply watched him, its gaze heavy and penetrating, as though it could see the very depths of his soul. "Why do you seek me, mortal?" the Goatman's voice rumbled, low and filled with an unnatural power. Victor, trembling but resolute, stepped forward. "I seek peace," he said, his voice cracking. "I have lost everything. My heart is broken, and I cannot bear it any longer. I've heard the stories of what you can offer, of how you can end the pain." The Goatman's eyes glimmered with understanding. "You wish for peace," it said, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. "But peace comes at a price, and the price is not one that you can easily pay." Victor's mind was clouded with desperation. "I don't care. I will pay whatever price is necessary. Just give me peace." The Goatman studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, the bargain is struck. I will grant you peace, but in return, you will give me that which is most precious to you." Victor's heart skipped a beat, but he did not hesitate. His grief was all-consuming, and the thought of relief was too tempting to pass up. "Take what you will," he whispered, not fully understanding the consequences of his words. The Goatman extended one of its long, twisted arms, and with a slow, deliberate motion, it placed a hand on Victor's chest. A chill unlike anything he had ever felt seeped into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. The pain in his heart, the grief, the loss, began to fade, melting away like a fog in the morning sun. For a moment, he felt light, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. But then, just as quickly as the relief came, it vanished. The peace was fleeting, replaced by a gnawing emptiness, a hollowness that consumed him. He could feel something slipping away, something vital, something he couldn't quite grasp. His vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to distort. "The price has been paid," the Goatman's voice echoed in his ears, but it no longer sounded comforting. It was filled with cold satisfaction. "You will never know peace again, Victor Hawthorne. You have given me your soul, and in return you are now bound to the forest. You will wander these woods for eternity, your grief never fading, your heart always aching." Victor staggered back, his breath shallow, his chest tightening with panic. No, I didn't understand. I didn't know." The Goatman's laughter rumbled through the trees like distant thunder. "You sought peace, but all you found was emptiness. The darkness within you is mine now." Victor screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the vast, oppressive woods. The Goatman stood in the clearing, watching him with eyes that burned brighter than ever before. As the creature faded into the shadows, Victor fell to his knees, clutching his chest as the weight of his decision crushed him. He had traded everything, his soul, his sanity, his very essence, for a fleeting moment of peace that was never meant to last. The forest closed in around him, the trees whispering in a language he could not understand. He could no longer tell where the forest ended and where his mind began. His soul was now part of the woods, condemned to wander for eternity, never to find the peace he had so desperately sought. And so, Victor Hawthorne became just another lost soul, a silent witness to the dark bargain he had made with the Goatman, a bargain he could never repay.